Malaysia should not be developed only in the economic sense. It must be a nation that is fully developed along all the dimensions: economically, politically, socially, spiritually, psychologically, and culturally.
Itulah yang dimaksudkan dengan Wawasan 2020.
Angkasa, lambang negara gagah. Rakyat sepakat sehati sejiwa, tekad berbakti dengan megah. Hadapi cabaran masa buka, penuh tenaga murni. Bakti dicurah searah sehala, dengan wawasan yang suci.
As far as I can remember, growing up in the 80s, Malaysia was a very different country to what it is today. Things were a lot simpler. You didn't have to earn a lot of money at the time. I think the measurements for happiness were very different back then compared to what it is today. So even though, there were not much development, we didn't have many cars on the road, we didn't even have many highways, but I think that for whatever that we have, it was very, very easy. I remember that the peak of your month, rather, was a trip to Chow Kit Road, and there used to be a co-op supermarket there, and that was a big deal for us, to go there and shop and come back with a full trolley. So just gives you a reflection of how simple things were back then.
There was the Iranian Revolution and the war between Afghanistan and Russia. And in the 80s, Malaysia was catching up with other countries. I mean, the Cold War was definitely a struggle of this bipolar world that we have. The West on one side and Russian and its alliance on the other side. Amongst Malaysians then, due to its neutrality, we have our own way in perceiving what Malaysia should be. We're talking about our national car, how Singapore, despite of its development, despite of its prosperity, but we have our own car, man. Those kind of things. Now, we begin to appreciate our own capability, our own abilities, and our own achievement then in the 80s.
The 80s were much simpler times. I remember TV only had one channel, then two channels, and then when TV3 came online, it was a huge deal. So back then it was way simpler. That paradigm of school, university, get a job, stay in the job until you retire, was the norm.
What I can remember about the 80s, I was pretty much a teenager back then, and all I can remember is basically great rock music and also rock dancer.
I still remember in Jordan when people talking about Malaysia, when I first arrived in Jordan early 1994, Malaysia was never known. People confuse us with either Chinese or Japanese or Koreans. And normally people like me with small eyes, they will call me Bruce Lee or Jackie Chan then. And then towards the end, towards the years 97, 98, 99, Malaysia became relatively well known among Jordanians, and not only among Jordanians, among Arabs, especially on IT. So that is where you would see a lot of Arab students started pouring into Malaysia, and MSc was a selling point then.
90s, KRE started her career as a singer, songwriter, producer, and we had a great time touring, meeting fans, and it was quite a life-changing experience for all of us.
Menyuruh kita bersatu, membangunkan Malaysia menjelang abad 2000. Satu langkahku, satu persatu, fikirkan strategi berkesan untuk maju.
When we recorded our first album, the buzzword was Wawasan 2020, and we thought it was a good vision or good direction where Malaysia will be 28 years down the road, you know. And to be honest with you, I was just a teenager when I wrote that song. I don't know much about Wawasan 2020, but we just thought that okay, we just need to unite, and I think that it was a good direction in terms of how to build Malaysia and how to shape Malaysia's future.
I remember Wawasan 2020. It was on TV. It was what all the teachers were talking about. It was a huge deal. Of course, being still in school, we didn't really understand high income nation and stuff like that. But we knew that we wanted to be. I think the catchphrase was "Masyarakat Maju," you know, whatever that meant lah, right? So I think in our minds too. And the images that we were fed was, not exactly flying cars, but back then the science fiction too would show TVs on watches and on flat screens and all that lah.
In 1991, I did not expect to be Prime Minister for very much longer. I needed 30 years, so I would not be able to oversee the implementation over 30 years. I had hoped that others would understand what the plan is all about. But they understand the objective, the target, but they do not understand how the target is to be achieved. That is why we find that they devise their own or interpret the vision in their own way, and that ran away from the actual vision. It was something else again. The emphasis is not the right emphasis, and therefore we were not able to achieve the objective. Although we have made certain physical progress, but in terms of your social attitude, your mental progress, it was not there. So that is why I'm not happy with the achievement. We could have done much better, but my successors changed their approach and their method to the extent that we lose sight of the target.
I think what went wrong was the succession plan. I mean, in Malaysia, whether you like it or not, politics determines everything. I mean, the political situation, then the non-continuity of what we have started with what happened later has caused us the collapse of our dream in the 90s. Should there be a smooth transition from Tun to Datuk Seri Anwar, we could see a much better future for Malaysia. But then when he was succeeded by somebody who couldn't deliver what he has started, and then continued with somebody who has brought Malaysia very popular in a very wrong way, and everything goes to the drain.
I was a big fan of Vision 2020, seriously. So when it doesn't really happen, I got frustrated, but at the same time, I felt, okay, maybe there's a hikmah behind it.
the multimedia super corridor. So I think, yes, it was a blueprint for Malaysia to kind of use a space and uplift them into the new technology world. But I think it's been very misunderstood in the sense that it's always thought as an infrastructure project, right? But then actually what is lacking in the MSc is actually the culture, the working culture. So this is the thing that hasn't been inspired from other similar space around the world, such as the Silicon Valley in California and all that sort of stuff. So without that, right, I think the whole ambition of MSc never really got to where it wanted to be.
Silicon Valley itself took 50 to 60 years to set up. And it's quite a unique environment, even within US itself, you know. So for us to just open up, a space with broadband infrastructure, it's not enough.
But having said that, I think it has its own answer to it, and Cyberjaya has actually evolved into its own brand of a tech town. It's very bohemian. It's got a lot of expatriate population. It's got a lot of students, right? And it's a very cool environment to work in. So in that aspect, I think it has evolved into something else.
Okay, we're basically a digital content solution provider for the publishers. We provide a marketplace primarily focused in Southeast Asia. You could simply jump to wherever you want to go. So let's say, for example, you want to jump to travel. So
you were calling this a magazine? This is a digital magazine?
Yeah, this is, for example, this is a magazine. But we've also got different samples for comics, for even novels, even literature books.
And you have soundtrack here.
Yeah, you could put audio, video, virtually anything. Virtually anything that fits the web could fit into this. This is the wonderful thing about the non-linear interactive books.
I got to know eCentral in early 2012 during my days as a venture capital at TIC Capital. One of my roles is to look for companies to invest in, and I came across Faiz, the co-founder of eCentral, at an event, and he shared with me about what he does with his brother Irfan, and that caught my attention, and we started talking from there.
eCentral was introduced to Storytel as the company that brought the ebooks to Malaysia by a local consultant that we were working with at the time. When we first met with Irfan and Faiz, we were impressed by the enthusiasm and energy they showed around ebooks, and also fascinated by the story behind why they started their company.
Our main drive, our main spirit behind wanting to do technopreneurship or wanting to do a startup was because we felt that there was a problem to be solved in Malaysia, and this was with relation to book distribution. So bookstores were only taking up books which gave them good percentage, not necessarily based on quality or creativity. So that kind of disturbed us, and for us to create a chain of bookstores to compete with them was very unlikely. It was probably not sensible. So, our only way of thinking was that, okay, we have to beat them technologically, and how do we bypass them? Was by doing an equivalent of what they were doing, but on the internet.
Well, young people are not influenced by old thinking, that this cannot be done by us. This is something that we have to import from others. They have a good mindset that enables them to think that they can penetrate the market, and they have the know-how.
Faiz and Irfan they were very young. They were young. To me, they look very young, innovative, energetic, very ambitious, and creative, I would say. I saw them as innovators, someone who want to make a difference and change in book space. And since I like reading, and of course I have a bit of a preference for what they do, because I think it is good for the market and is unique.
What stood out about East Central is that they built that platform, right? The other players in Malaysia, they were all, they would license foreign technology and they would digitalize Malaysian content, right? So that gave us an indication of the founder's vision of East Central itself. You know, it was about it was creating a platform for people to create content. So this is the type of real ideas that should have been funded by the Malaysian government.
So the ebook ecosystem came into mind. We then realized that, oh, okay, this is not just as easy as just creating a website or a few apps. This involved a lot of other things like, you know, encryption, cryptography, which we spent a lot of time and money on in the initial stage of the business.
I first became aware of eCentral 10 years ago when we were looking for ebook distributors to distribute Western content in Southeast Asia. eCentral had received very good reviews from local and Western publishers who spoke very highly of them. I was immediately impressed with how advanced their sign-up and onboarding were. And at that time, they were far ahead of larger companies like Apple and Google, who had very difficult setup procedures and requirements. They had a calm sense of knowing what was going on, and their level of innovation was impressive. If eCentral had emerged in China or North America, I'm sure they would have become the leader in either of those two very competitive marketplaces.
Compared to Malaysia, we have a smaller population, smaller reading population, and smaller spending power, especially on digital goods. So if eCentral were to be in Japan, I think it would be different.
For creating a market, I think this is the thing that we were really successful at doing. Creating a market from nothing, from least amount of funding, least amount of money that was possible. And looking back at all of this, a lot of people actually ask us, how did we survive all that? How did we manage to you know, go through so much hardship with so little money, creating something with so little money? And it was easy. It's all about resilience. It's all about stamina. It's all about living within your means, yeah? You know, all of this will contribute into something greater if you don't make too much mistakes. But there's no margin for error.
So you can't create or train entrepreneurs, right? But what you can do is you can create a conducive environment for the spirit of entrepreneurship, right? To attract those risk takers, those people with ideas. You have all these people who conduct entrepreneurship in your course. That's fine to motivate a person, right? But in terms of feeding them the reality of entrepreneurship, especially technology-based entrepreneurship, where it can be macam do or die lah, right? It doesn't really prepare them for that, right?
So I think the romantic part about being a startup was only the early days, only the creation part of it. But the moment that it's created, the building of the market that does not exist, the squabbling over that market share that does not exist with the bigger corporations and stuff like that was, to be least said, frustrating, you know?
It's nice to talk about, it's sexy, multi-billion-dollar businesses and how you started in the garage and then you build. Tapi a lot of the story pasal what the environment they operated in is not being told, you know?
You know, investors started to sniff around, and eventually we sealed a series of fund from venture capital. In our history, I think that the company was never really in line with the thinking and thoughts of venture capital, because venture caps are only bothered about themselves. They're only concerned about their bottom line. They're only concerned about you know, how much percentage that they can make from you. Pretty much they're banks, right? Banks that took a bit more than what banks normally take. So after that, we then quickly realized that we wanted to go into a different direction, and that we got off from the regular track of what people normally tell you, this is the right way, you know, you go into Series B, you go into Series C, and then you go into IPO and all that. And we went off track, and we went into the direction of having, you know, a corporate partner. And what we mean by this is that a corporation can not just bring you the assistance of funding, but also in the sense that it brings you synergy in terms of business and a working partner. And this is what we actually needed then, you know.
I think eCentral have an exciting landscape ahead of them, where they can innovate and come up with more interesting products to suit the evolution of how consumer read.
It took Storytel 5 to 7 years to hit off the Swedish market. Changing people's behavior takes time and money. You are likely to succeed sooner or later, depending on how stubborn you are and how much money you can spend. It will for sure be challenging, but digital content is the future. It just comes later in some parts of the world.
As far as I understand, there are some available information from them which they've released. There's roughly about 2,500, 3,000 startups today in Malaysia. So after, what, 20 years? 25 years since the MSC was created. After 50 years since you know, Intel came on board.
In the meantime, governments also start to encourage a lot of young people who came out of universities, who just graduated, to actually go into technopreneurship, to startup in droves, you know.
And here he is, the man himself.
Oh, the team. Oh.
Welcome, Tan Sri.
Hi.
And I think these people didn't know what they got themselves into. They don't understand that this is something that's not for the faint-hearted. And I think the bigger issue is that these people didn't realize that it is not just about business, it's about resilience, it's about making something grow from nothing. And this is also something that was new to us as well, because we came from a business that the market was already there, and you just had to create a better product. Into something that didn't even exist, and we had to create that market.
I think it's all relative, you know, from an absolute perspective. The government will say, you know, we are doing whatever we can to try to spur the local ecosystem, but there is a reality pill that we will need to look into, right? If let's say Grab would have wanted to raise funding, they would have struggled to find the right type of funding levels or availability over here in Malaysia. I've spoken to most of the local investors, right? That the investment profiles and the availability of capital for a company of our size and our scale is also a bit lacking. And this, I think, is going to be one of the main contributing factors on whether or not we will be able to build unicorns out of Malaysia.
So you can't find that in Malaysia. So what Malaysian startups would have to do inevitably is to search for funding overseas.
We have been lacking, and where we have failed is to compare ourselves against Singapore. Singapore is a small market, right? Malaysia is a relatively, it's a larger market than Singapore, but still relatively small compared to the rest. But why is it that Singapore can attract the Grabs, okay, the Twitters, the Facebooks, the Amazons, the Lazadas, the ByteDancers, you know, the Oracles, the Stripes, to actually set up their headquarters in Singapore in comparison to Malaysia? It's a system of policies.
And once they get there, they will discover that that further funding is actually an exclusive club. You know, you have to be putting aside the business model and the product viability. I think you have to be of a certain background, I think, for you to make it easier to get funding at that stage now.
Now, although I would say the tech industry has matured somewhat, or has matured a lot actually, not somewhat, the venture capital industry has remained to be, I think the word would be still very much government funded. We lack private sector funding.
A lot of the VCs in Malaysia are bankers background. Back then, I don't know now. And they look at it from the business plan perspective and market perspective, market size, not on potential perspective, because a lot of them do not understand tech. So that's a bit of a limitation as to, again, tangible, non-tangible, yeah? So a lot of the locals, they look at tangible as something they can understand, something that intangible, they can't understand.
When it involves venture capitals, it is about showing growth. And showing growth might be in a realistic way, or in a natural progression, or it could be in an artificial way. So when VCs come in, they would want you to grow the company in an artificial way, because then that would promise an earlier exit. So the best way to do is that you spend a lot of money on advertising, you make yourself look a lot bigger than what you are, get nice offices and stuff like that. But that doesn't really necessarily reflect at the health check of that particular company or VC.
Because this venture model is not based on profitability. It's based on growth. It's based on getting new customers, more marketing, new markets, new customers. And a lot of times they acquire new customers by subsidizing, you know. I think the product market fit is actually false, because you are selling a product, an underpriced product. So people who are adopting it are not really they are not really benefiting totally from the utility of your product.
This is always the perennial question. How do we measure success of policies or plans, right? The government will look at it from the number of jobs created, the number of startups having received grants, the amount of follow-up funding, etc., right? But I think maybe there's an easy way to really measure it. How many large companies have grown out of these programs?
The main aim for this country is actually to have a lot of successful startups, smaller in size perhaps, but they become real and legitimate business, rather than just having one singular unicorn that becomes a monopoly of everything. And this notion of wanting to have a unicorn that will go globally is a myth, and it's something that you can't produce. It will happen when the time comes, when the time is right, when it's conducive enough, and when there's enough reasons for it to happen. It doesn't happen because we created it. It will not be like that. So this is the thing that I think have been some mistakes of the country in the past. You know, we are here to stand correct of all of these things.
Demonstrated application grant scheme. So we in Malaysia actually are blessed that the government has been so supportive of the tech industry ever since the year 1995, when the MSC was started, right? But unfortunately, of course, fortunately for us, or fortunately, the government gave to some of us that survived till today. 90% of those that got those incentives at that time didn't survive, right?
There is a high failure rate in the early stage, higher than normal, right? So typically in a normal startup, you know, about 1 in 4 or 1 in 5 dies within the first year. 30% dies within the second year, and 70% are dead within a decade. That is normal.
The government shouldn't only just provide too much support, because when the government provides too much support, then it creates an uneven playing field, which actually is negative to the industry. Government should actually continue to support in a way like policy support is one very, I would say, crucial way to make sure the policies are supportive of the industry. Government should focus on policies. Government shouldn't be getting in the game themselves.
It's quite common for any Malaysian tech to face double standards. This is quite normal. And I think partly it's because Malaysians by nature are quite inferior in and lack of self-belief, in the sense that maybe from their past experience, a lot of so-called Malaysian businesses in the past used to promise everything out of the sky and couldn't deliver. So this has caused some sort of phobia or trauma to a lot of the decision makers in Malaysia.
I had a fantastic, great meeting with PM. Very interesting. My inspiration came from the MSC. I started my business in 1995, started China Pager, the first internet company in China. And I was wondering where to go, how internet, how this kind of technology, digital technology can empower society, empower people. Then one day I was reading newspaper, I saw this multimedia super corridor. I said, wow, this is a genius idea.
How do we avoid being colonized in a different manner? How do you ensure that the local companies are being protected instead of being at the end of the line all the time?
The way that should be run is to ask the local players, how can you work with them? Not the other way around, right? If you ask the foreign players, how can you work with local players, they will make it in a way, or they will recommend a way which is beneficial for them. You get what I mean? So we get the crumbs and they get the nasi to support. Okay, if we want to work with Alibaba, well, how can we work with, what do we want? Not what Alibaba wants. Because Alibaba will do it so that they will be the leader, they will be the giant, we be the machai. So much so the agencies start, they also get into the same football game, competing among one another. They need to hear from the industry. The industry should set the KPIs. The agency shouldn't set their own KPIs. Before they set the KPI, they already know how to achieve it, but whether it helps the industry or not is secondary.
So when I was there, I started in 2001. These agencies were primarily run and managed by government officials. And the big argument was, oh, what does government know? Hire some IT guys, right? So that I noticed there was some difference there. And there were many improvements. But there were also some great legacies left by the government people, right? Every organization requires middle managers, right? The middle management in every organization around the world is the most critical workforce. So if you remove those guys, then there's something wrong. Yeah, so the important job of middle management is aligning them to a vision and a strategy, which relates to building industry.
You have a lot of these so-called government bodies, government-related agencies, right, that kind of look themselves as the driver for ICT. And in that, one of the pillars usually will probably involve startups, okay? But here's the thing, the problem is that a lot of these people are, they are ex-corporate executives and stuff like that work from the 42nd floor of some building. They're not in touch with the reality, usually. And then they come into these agencies and then they think that, yep, I'm gonna start helping startups because that's what I watch in Hollywood flicks, right? But the truth is that startup is just a fancy name of starting up any business, yeah? And the gruesome part of it is that it requires a lot of time. You're not going to be able to spend weekends like normally anymore. You're not going to be able to spend lavishly if you earn a lot of money, because a lot of the money will have to be used in fueling your project and your dream. So all these agencies don't put all that crap into consideration. They are only talking about oh yeah, the good stuff, this is that, right? And painting a so-called story that this is the ideal world, yeah, and lets everybody join the startup. What's worse is that I think these people, they are looking at their own KPI. Yeah, they don't give a shit about you actually. So they are just doing things to make them look good, whilst you are like still wondering what's happening, you know, this and that, whatnot. And from time to time, they'll give out grants, and by all means, we will participate in that, no problem. You know, I mean, who doesn't want grants? But in all of this, sometimes you got to go and pitch, you got to go do this and that, whatnot, and for them, it's like a circus, it's like a spectacle. You know, oh, it's great, man. Can you pitch to us in 2 minutes and stuff like that? When in actual fact, a real business, you need to actually go down to that person's office. You got to really see and study how they work for, you know, a day or two. Then you can understand the true feel or the challenges that they are facing. You can't bloody tell something from a 2-minute, you know, interview. It doesn't make sense, right? So this is the sort of things that I think is really wrong. It doesn't just happen here, it also happens abroad. I do believe in that. But for them, it's just one particular spectacle, and they think it's fun, they think it's cool, but they don't really take into consideration of these startup companies that actually have to go through that. We are one of those that survived all that. Yeah, maybe you know, it made us a lot tougher. But I think that if the environment was a lot better and less cheesy, yeah, or less quirky, then I think you would have attracted a lot more smarter people into this particular industry. And the people that were willing to do all these nonsense as well weren't people that, they didn't even belong to the tech world in the first place. And this was the issue. We were attracting assholes.
Should look at how other smaller countries have been able to push tech in terms of investment, in terms of consumption, and that would help instead of having things all over the place and not consolidated. That's my personal feeling. It's about time after what, 20 years having MDAG and all this development. We cannot do the same thing and expect a different results, in my opinion. Sorry.
And because of that, of course, we gradually people overtake and went ahead of us. Certainly Korea, for example, done extremely well. But Malaysia, you hear about the target, you don't even understand the target. And certainly you don't understand how to achieve the target. That is the most important thing.
And then we have a period of whereby our growth we're looking more, or we're skewing more towards education. And that's because both of our shareholders at the time were from the education sector.
It's a good platform for, say, for textbooks, for school textbooks. And I think East Central took the right steps. They had the right investor in place, they had the right partnerships, and they were talking to the right people.
Number one, the blueprint is there. I know it was good. It was a good one, but it needs to be enhanced. It needs to be more appropriated with the IR 4.0, because the one that been presented was developed in 2012.
So the perception that Malaysian technology is not on par and all that is very misleading, because a lot of things that are done in this part of the world now is very, very advanced. But having said all this, for Malaysian companies to really sell to, let's say, the government sectors, or or even to the public, we still have that stigma of let's say, a foreign product is better and stuff like that, especially amongst the government sector, because this is hard to avoid after, 20, 30 years of, I would say, propaganda to say that products such as Microsoft and Google, IBM for that matter, if you're talking about in the 80s and 90s, are the superior products. So until today, that particular teaching is still very, very coherent inside the management of the country.
The only digital products that we were exposed to were the big brands. So IBM would sell you a machine and you would run Microsoft Windows on it, right? And it was so protected that we Malaysians at that stage always saw themselves as users, not as creators who could actually adopt and create stuff using these platforms.
I think we came in very late into the game, but despite of being late, the education industry in Malaysia, when you speak of digital, it's always been stagnant in the e-learning hemisphere. It hasn't really moved from that, They're still talking about e-learning, they're still talking about a full-time connectivity. I think what ebook brought in was that the ability to distribute interactive digital content in a conducive manner with very minimal support of ICT infrastructure like internet and devices. So when we did that successfully, it became a threat to many. But what we realized then is that in Malaysia, more than 90% of schools, or the movement for schools, is government, it's public schools. And therefore, the foundation behind our education must come from the policies that are driven from the ministries. Now, in Malaysia, the ministry, the issue is not the ministers, I would say. The issue is that the whole army of civil servants inside the ministry doesn't want to make any changes to our education, still interested in maintaining the legacy machinery that there are. And because of this, it is very difficult to make any positive changes in our education. And I can safely say that until we're very serious about changing the way or the method that the education machinery works in our ministry, then we can forget about making any improvement or progress in our education. So it's as easy as that, I think.
Implementation side in government agencies, they're not ready yet, and they're not able, they were not able to understand the aspiration of the people who wanted change to be happen overnight. On one side, we have people who wanted changes, and they wanted it to happen yesterday, So when there's a change of government, they're expecting everything to be implemented overnight. So, and they almost forgot that yes, we can change a lot of policies, but again, the implementation side is more important part of it.
So I think the story behind East Central is actually that. It's actually about the chances that we had, and it was only one time that you could make any mistakes, and that despite of all the odds, we prevailed through because we didn't behave like all the other startups that were encouraged to spend a lot of money, that were encouraged to make themselves look bigger than what they actually are and stuff like that. But this was never really appreciated because these sort of things don't make stories. The things that make stories is all the glam and all the shows. You know, those are the things that will become the talk of town. Saving money, depression, and all of that doesn't make news in the startup world, you know. But in reality, this is what it is.